In every army, fear keeps the line steady. But when that fear turns inward, it becomes something far darker than war itself. The decimation, Rome's lottery of death. In the brutal heart of Rome's military machine, loyalty was forged not only through honor, but through fear. When a legion faltered, when men ran, disobeyed, or lost their will to fight, the punishment was not directed at the guilty alone. It was called decimation, and it was as horrifying as it was effective. Soldiers were divided into groups of 10, and by the cold hand of fate, one man from each group was chosen to die, not by sword or executioner, but at the hands of his comrades. Those who survived were forced to deliver the sentence, beating their brother-in-arms to death while officers looked on. Imagine the silence before the first blow, the trembling hands gripping stones, the sickening realization that survival came at the cost of killing your own. The message was simple: cowardice infected all, and only terror could cure it. The Romans believed this cruelty preserved discipline, but beneath the glory of their empire lay a truth carved in blood, that sometimes the greatest enemy a soldier feared was his own army. The running the gauntlet, death in motion. There was no courtroom, no trial, and no escape. Only a narrow path lined with men who once called you brother. Running the gauntlet was punishment disguised as redemption, a march through agony meant to wash away dishonor with blood. From the 17th century through the age of muskets, deserters and thieves were stripped, beaten, and forced to sprint between two endless ranks of soldiers armed with sticks, whips, or bayonets. Each step forward was a gamble between pain and death. The condemned could hear the hiss of breath, the crack of wood against flesh, the laughter of those who feared becoming next. Some collapsed midway, only to be dragged upright and made to continue until their body failed completely. Commanders claimed it was justice, an ancient ritual to restore discipline, but in truth, it was theater, a slow, public unraveling of one man's humanity to remind hundreds of others that mercy had no place in war. The Mongol army's group punishment. In the vast, windswept steppes of Asia, the Mongol army moved like a storm, disciplined, merciless, and bound by a code that made fear itself a weapon. Every soldier lived and died not as an individual, but as part of a unit known as an army, 10 men whose fates were tied together by the strict law of collective punishment. If one fled in battle, all 10 were executed. If one disobeyed, all bore the penalty. This was how Genghis Khan built an empire out of chaos, by making loyalty absolute and failure unthinkable. The punishment was swift and public, a grim reminder that the horde's strength lay in unity, not mercy. Men would fight through exhaustion, wounds, and terror rather than risk bringing death upon their brothers. Even the smallest act of defiance could doom an entire group, turning comrades into enforcers of the Khan's will. Yet this system forged an army unlike any the world had seen. Unyielding, synchronized, and feared across continents. Under the shadow of Mongol banners, no one stood alone, and no sin was ever personal. In the horde, discipline was survival, and survival was bought with blood. The Iron Coffins of Prussia, discipline by design. In the cold, regimented world of 18th century Prussia, discipline was not just demanded, it was engineered. Under King Frederick the Great, soldiers became living machines, drilled until instinct replaced thought, obedience replacing will. But when one broke the chain of order,
Punishment came not in haste, but in design. The deserter was locked inside an iron coffin, a standing cage shaped like a man, forged to hold him upright as the hours stretched into days. Exposed to the elements, the prisoner could not sit, rest, or sleep. His suffering was a lesson to the ranks. Villagers and comrades were made to watch, their eyes drawn to the iron figure as it shimmered under rain or frost, a silent monument to what happened when duty faltered. The Prussian army's strength lay in this unyielding system, pain sculpted into discipline, fear molded into loyalty. To falter once was to die slowly, encased in steel and shame. In the heart of Europe's most efficient war machine, humanity was stripped away, leaving behind only the clang of metal and the echo of obedience forged in iron.
The Nazi Wehrmacht, execution for cowardice. In the final years of the Third Reich, the greatest threat to a German soldier wasn't always the enemy ahead, but the command behind. Under Hitler's iron decree, retreat was treason and hesitation was death. Men who faltered were dragged before makeshift courts, often judged in minutes, condemned for cowardice before the enemy. They were forced to dig their own graves, handed blindfolds they dared not wear, and executed by firing squads made up of their own comrades. Some were teenagers who had never fired a shot, others veterans broken by endless war. More than 20,000 soldiers were executed this way, their names erased, their families shamed into silence. It was discipline through terror, an army consuming itself to preserve its illusion of strength. And as the Reich collapsed, the gunfire of those executions echoed through the ruins, a grim reminder that fear, not loyalty, had become the last command of the Nazi war machine. The Soviet Red Army, the order of no retreat. In the summer of 1942, as Nazi forces pushed deep into Soviet territory, Joseph Stalin issued an order that would turn the entire Red Army into a wall of human resolve, or desperation. It was called Order Number 227, known by 3 words that froze every soldier's blood: not one step back. Under this decree, retreat was treason, and hesitation meant death not from the enemy, but from one's own side. Barrier troops were stationed behind the front lines, tasked with shooting any man who fled. Commanders who lost ground were executed or sent to penal battalions, suicide units forced to charge enemy lines unarmed, their lives spent to redeem their supposed cowardice. For the Red Army, the battlefield became a trap between 2 killers, the Germans ahead and their own leaders behind. Yet in that crucible of terror, soldiers fought with a grim fury, driven by fear, pride, and the will to survive another hour. The price of every inch of Soviet soil was written in blood, and the echo of that order still haunts history, a command that turned men into martyrs and obedience into sacrifice. The American Civil War, drumming out the disgraced. In the chaos of the American Civil War, not every man who wore the uniform would leave the ranks with honor. Some were thieves, deserters, or cowards who broke the unspoken code of brotherhood. And for them, there was no quiet dismissal, only public humiliation. It was called drumming out, a ritual of disgrace meant to strip a soldier of his identity and dignity before his comrades. The condemned man was paraded before the regiment, his buttons torn from his coat, insignias ripped from his sleeves. Drummers beat a slow, mocking rhythm as the column marched him past rows of stony faces. Men he once called brothers, now forbidden to speak his name. Sometimes his head was shaved or his weapon broken in two, symbols of his unworthiness to bear arms again. The sound of the drums echoed long after he was gone, a reminder that the army demanded not just courage, but obedience and pride.
To be drummed out was worse than death. It was to be erased from history, condemned to walk among the living as a ghost of one's own betrayal. The North Korean military prisons. Hidden beyond the mountains of North Korea lies a world few have seen, and even fewer have survived. The vast network of military prisons where loyalty is tested through suffering. These are not mere detention centers, but black holes of obedience, where prisoners vanish into endless labor and silence. Guards rule with absolute power, their authority unchecked, their cruelty ritualized. Inside the electrified fences, inmates, soldiers, defectors, even officers, are forced to confess crimes they never committed, beaten until their voices break and their will dissolves. Days blur into years under the weight of starvation and endless work in the mines, where breathing the dust is a death sentence of its own. No one speaks of escape. The walls are not just made of concrete and barbed wire, but of fear that reaches generations beyond. Families of the accused share their fate, born into cells for sins they never knew. In these hidden prisons, punishment becomes inheritance, and silence becomes survival. For those who enter, there is no trial, no redemption, only the slow erosion of the human spirit beneath the shadow of eternal control. The Japanese Imperial Army's beatings. Within the ranks of the Japanese Imperial Army, fear was not only directed at the enemy, it lived among the soldiers themselves. Discipline was enforced through brutal ritual beatings, a practice known as binta that blurred the line between correction and cruelty. New recruits were struck for the smallest mistake, for a missed salute, or for failing to respond with absolute precision. Senior officers used fists, boots, and rifle butts as instruments of obedience, their violence justified as a way to forge loyalty and endurance. The beatings were not momentary punishments. They were public performances, meant to remind every man that weakness was a sin and compassion a threat to control. Some soldiers endured hundreds of blows in a single night, collapsing under the weight of hierarchy that demanded silence over pain. To question it was treason, to resist was unthinkable. This cycle of brutality spread like infection, passed from victim to superior, shaping an army that fought with unwavering discipline, but at the cost of its humanity. Behind the empire's iron resolve were men trained not just to kill, but to obey through fear, molded by pain until they became its instruments.
The French Foreign Legions march or die. In the unforgiving deserts of North Africa, the French Foreign Legion forged men through a single brutal command: march or die. Recruits from every corner of the world, drawn by desperation or adventure, were pushed beyond human limits, forced to march for days under scorching sun and over jagged terrain with only the weight of their packs and the threat of death to propel them forward. Those who faltered faced not only exhaustion, but the wrath of officers who saw weakness as betrayal. Lagging soldiers were beaten, left behind, or sometimes shot to set an example. Hunger gnawed at them, blisters tore their feet, and the wind carried the cries of the fallen as lessons in obedience. Yet the Legion's cruelty was also its method of survival, teaching men to rely on discipline, resilience, and each other in a world that offered no mercy. By the time they reached the end of the march, the men who remained were transformed into a single unit of unparalleled endurance, shaped by fear, blood, and relentless hardship. In the Legion, the line between life and death was measured in every step, and each march became a crucible where only the strongest or the most obedient could endure. Across centuries, uniforms changed. Swords became rifles,
Rifles became drones, but the psychology of control never evolved. Commanders learned that pain can build order faster than trust. But history whispers a different truth. An army that rules through fear wins battles, yet loses its soul. So the next time we glorify discipline, remember, behind every victory parade, there are echoes of the punished. And sometimes, those echoes march louder than the drums of war.